The most insane punishments that are worse than death. The old wives' tale that life was easier back then may be true, yet if you crossed the lawbreakers, it was game over for you. And not in a rushed manner either, no sir. The criminal justice system's punishments were horrendous. If you were spared physical punishment, it was likely to be humiliating. Let's look down to some extremely insane punishment given, which is worse than death. You'll be shocked, and might get scared of it as well. A grisly death in a metal bowl. Even just thinking about it has a chilling effect on me. Those who committed crimes in ancient Greece were subjected to the punishment of being cooked inside a massive bronze bowl. The person who was found guilty was then placed inside a bowl made of metal, and a fire was ignited below it. This caused the person's death by slow, painful burning. The bystanders used to take pleasure in witnessing this particularly brutal act, and they even considered it a form of entertainment. The Cucking Stool, also known as the Ducking Stool. In New England and England throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, women who were found guilty of unwomanly behavior were made to sit on cucking stools as a form of punishment. At that time, it was deemed unwomanly for a woman to engage in activities such as gossiping, backbiting, having a dispute with her husband, or fighting with the neighbors. The woman who was found guilty of the crime was tied to a stool and repeatedly submerged in water, maybe from a lake or stream. In historical texts, the cucking stool is also referred to as the ducking stool on occasion. Being trampled by elephants. Ancient societies in Southeast Asia were responsible for developing one of the most chilling techniques of carrying out the death penalty. The condemned individuals were put to death by having elephants stand on them and crush their bodies. From the time of the Mughals into the late 19th century, this approach enjoyed widespread adoption throughout India. The prisoners were forced to lie down, and then agitated wild elephants would repeatedly run over them, assuring a swift but excruciating end for them. Crucifixion. It was a widespread practice throughout the medieval centuries to nail or bind people to a wooden cross and then leave them there to die a slow and agonizing death as onlookers watched. One example of this is the story of Jesus Christ's crucifixion, which illustrates the brutality of this method. Crucifixion's best feature was the fear it produced in its witnesses, which rendered them mentally incapable of committing any crime or rebelling against authorities. Yeah, I say this sarcastically, that this was the crucifixion's best feature, according to those that perpetrated it. Ling Chi. Ling Chi was a form of excruciating execution that was common in China. It was also known as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts. The condemned person was typically beheaded or had a final cut made to their heart before they were left hanging from a pole, while their skin and limbs were gradually severed one at a time. Beginning in the 10th century, people have been making use of it continuously for the subsequent 980 years. 1905 was the year that it was finally made illegal. Putting humans in danger by using rats. Even in modern times, it is not unheard of for people to be murdered or tortured by rats. In the past, this practice was more prevalent. As part of the mechanism that is known as a rat trap, a rodent would be contained within a cage. The opposite side of the bottomless cage would be heated, and the prisoner's body, typically the torso, would be forced to bear the heat of that side. After realizing that the opposite side of the victim's body was inaccessible due to the heat, the despondent rat would gradually gnaw away at the victim's flesh in an effort to make a way for itself. Keel Hauling. Keel hauling was a form of corporal punishment that was developed in the late 16th century by the Dutch Navy for the purpose of specifically targeting sailors. The perpetrators of the crime were cuffed with rope and dragged through the water from one end of the ship to the other. Even though many people drowned or suffered internal injuries as a result of the technique, it was not always intended to be lethal all the time. Men were punished by keel hauling frequently had their skin torn off by barnacles that grew on the keel of the ship, and they carried the scars with them for the rest of their lives. This was an added perk, if they were to have survived, that is. Boiling. Shellfish are the only modern-day victims of the cruel practice of live boiling, but many years ago this practice was widely used as a kind of capital punishment anywhere from East Asia to England. The condemned person was disrobed before being thrown into a vat or pot filled with a boiling liquid, which was typically either water, oil, or tar. The criminal could also be submerged in cold liquid before the liquid is brought to a boil in order to provide a more horrible experience. According to records that date back to the reign of Henry VIII, some individuals were put in a pot of boiling water for as long as 2 hours before they passed away. Torture of rats. The concept of torturing rats appears to be alive and well in the thought of those who are creative, since it was recently utilized in the movie Too Fast, Too Furious, as well as in the television series Game of Thrones. The victims made to lie on their stomach or chest naked while a hungry and/or ill rat is placed in a bucket on top of them. This horrifying method of torture is admittedly rather inventive. The bucket's heated from the outside, and the agitated rat begins to gnaw its way through the poor person's body, as well as any organ it occurs to come across while making its way out. Execution vans. China has developed frighteningly effective methods for carrying out the death penalty. The fact that China is the country that carries out the most executions on a yearly basis of any nation in the world should not come as much of a surprise. Fraud against the government, starting fires intentionally, and prostitution are examples of the kind of offenses that can result in the death penalty. The majority of executions in China are now carried out with mobile execution units, which are essentially vans that are stocked with the appropriate chemicals and restraints for carrying out lethal injections. Since roughly 10 years ago, the vans, which have the appearance of regular police vehicles, have been driving around. There are dozens of them dispensing lethal punishment all throughout the country, and they can be found in close proximity to the site of crimes. The Chinese government claims that these facilities are not only more cost-effective than more conventional ones, but that they are also more merciful than other preferred modes of execution, which is death by firing squad. Gridiron. The gridiron functioned in much the same way as a grill, for cooking people over a fire. It had the form of a grid made of iron and was positioned over a fire or coals that were burning. This was as one might imagine. Some of the victims were even doused in oil before they were roasted to guarantee that they would properly broil. But try not to worry too much about what happened to them later on. Probably. Drawing and quartering. One of the most notorious forms of cruel and unusual punishment was the practice of drawing and quartering the victim. It's still hard to accept that it is a real phenomenon that was created by real people, and that it actually occurred to real people who were unlucky in some way. In the 13th century, the punishment was initially imposed in England for the first time. After being hauled or chained to a horse and dragged to the gallows, the guilty were typically hanged, and in some cases they were also disemboweled or beheaded. The condemned person was then quartered, which means that the body was cut into 4 sections. This was often accomplished by tying each limb to a separate horse and making them gallop in opposing directions. This particular form of punishment was designated for people who were found guilty of treason and was done away with in the year 1867. Sawed in half. It still conveys the same meaning, namely that individuals were typically executed by having their bodies sawn in half. This particular method of putting someone to death was utilized in a variety of jurisdictions around the world, including the Roman Empire, Spain, and certain regions of Asia. Another form of punishment that was quite similar to this was called disembowelment, which included removing a living person's organs in order to bring about his death more gradually. That's all for the video today. We'll be right back with more, so don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.